We've got questions. Now, what does Kenya's trade relationship with the world look like? So for most of the period 1998 to 2024, Kenya's export market has grown faster than global import markets. Kenya exports to emerging markets. This means the demand from emerging markets outstripped demand from established advanced markets in terms of its growth. Its rate. Global import growth also outstripped Kenya's global exports in goods. This is alarming, right? So if global imports, the growth rate of global imports outstripped the expansion rate of Kenya's global exports in goods. This is alarming because it means Kenya is underperforming, and Kenya has been underperforming for the period 1998 to 2024. Finally, IMF projections assume that after 3.5 decades of underperformance, Kenyan exports will suddenly outperform global demand in growth in terms of its in terms. The IMF should explain the basis of its optimism. Now, what's the theoretical underpinning behind this? So the primary justification of carrying out an assessment of export demand and supply dynamics is to build an understanding of the state and evolution of the producer surplus and the demand for goods and services from households, firms, and governments that contributes to the generation of that surplus. International trade is driven primarily by comparative advantages. Comparative advantages are influenced by connectedness of producers and consumers to global markets, domestic and global macroeconomic conditions, fiscal and monetary policy, and the domestic political and geopolitical interactions that also contribute to the creation of these conditions. The balance of payments itself tabulates the state of a nation's economic relationship with the rest of the world. Depending on the depth of analysis, an assessment of export demand and supply dynamics can reveal the potential effects all these factors have on producer surplus. This analysis is a step towards understanding Kenya's goods export patterns. The policymaker would exploit such an assessment in generating policy that expands the surplus and removes bottlenecks that suppress the expansion of that producer and consumer surplus. The producer would also make use of such an assessment in advocating for policy that meets the same aims. And finally, the consumer wants to expand his choice in order to expand the consumer surplus and in sum, the welfare that he enjoys. So, how did we complete this analysis? This time series compared growth rates of global markets, Kenya's export markets, and Kenyan goods exports. The data used to create this series came from the World Economic Outlook database and the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics. Indices for global markets were generated using global import data and a base year of 1998. This base year was chosen to allow the inclusion of China, a Kenyan trade partner whose data pre-1998 was missing. This base also saw the elimination of Zambia, Afghanistan, and Iran due to missing data. The deletion of Afghanistan, Zambia, and Iran resulted in the creation of new weights for the export destinations. Indices for Kenyan export destinations were generated by selecting Kenyan export destinations from the global indices created above. The selection was based on Kenya's export market destinations as revealed by Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics data. Kenya's export destinations for the year 2023 were selected. The selection of Kenya's export destinations was limited to destinations in the year 2023. This is a simplification that implies that Kenya's export destinations were constant for the period 1998 to 2023, and that not only were the destinations constant, but the share of Kenya's trade that they took was constant. This is unlikely to be true and is the first and most important limit to this analysis. Kenya's export destinations do not have an equal share of Kenya's exports, right? You look throughout the years. Again, in the creation of indices of Kenya's export market growth, each nation is weighted against its share of Kenya's exports. The weights created exploit data from the year 2023. To generate the indices of Kenya's export market growth, these weights are multiplied by the indices of Kenya's export destination. This is done in order to relativize the growth in Kenya's export market to the shares of Kenyan exports that each specific destination took. Now, let's take that back slowly. What does it mean that we did? So, indices for Kenya's export market destination are generated by selecting Kenyan export destination from the global indices created above. The global indices were created by IMF data. Let me actually open a chart to demonstrate this. So here, global volume, the volume of global imports, all the imports from the world by nation. This comes from the IMF's World Economic Outlook data. So you can see data on the volume of imports of goods. The percentage change in those imports from Afghanistan all the way down to Zimbabwe. Right? You can see here Vietnam shrinks by negative 28% and then grows here by 22%. Now, the next thing that happens is that a global imports indices are created. Right? So for each nation, the base year is 1998, so that makes for 100. Now, what is happening here? Throughout history, the volume of goods imported by different countries around the world has been changing. But then we want to say, how has it changed since the year 1998? So 1998 becomes the base to which we compare everything that comes after. So here, for example, Albania in the year 1999 saw an expansion in the volume of growth of 30%, right? So the index is 130. and so on and so forth. Now, the next thing we do is we want to select the countries to which Kenya makes exports to. Now, those countries were chosen to get right Kenya's export trade partners by going to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, finding the nations to which Kenya made exports in the year 2023, and then saying, okay, go back to the World Economic Outlook data by the IMF, take away all the other countries and leave only the countries to which Kenya made exports. Now, what we do next is you have the value of total exports by country destinations. And what we want to do is say, okay, what share did each of these countries take of Kenya's total exports? Here, for example, Belgium took 80%. No, sorry. Not 80%. 8%. 8%. Right? You can see Europe took 23%, Africa 43%, and so on and so forth, right? We take that data and now we create weights. So each country receives a weight, each of Kenya's export partners. But then, because we removed Afghanistan, Zambia, and Iran, we had to recalculate the weight, right? So here, so you need to adjust the weight because you've deleted the countries as 3 countries to which Kenya made exports. So, you're saying that, how do you explain this? If you have eggs in a basket and you had, say, 10 eggs and 5 eggs went to China and 3 eggs went to the United States, and then 1 egg went to Afghanistan and 1 egg went to Iran. Okay, you say, all right, you know what? I want to focus on the other eggs. Why? In this case, it was because of missing. Now, what was it again? Missing data. Okay, but the point is, because you've taken 2 eggs out and now you have only 8 eggs, you have to recalculate the share, right? Because before you had 50% of the eggs going to China. Now you need to recalculate it because it's not 5 out of 10 eggs anymore. It's actually 5 out of 8 eggs going to China. So that's the idea. So here you have countries, Kenya's export destinations, the weighted share of exports for the year 2022, weighted share of exports for the year 2023, and then you also have the recalculation of the weights based on the fact that some countries were taken out. Now, you have here the total index, by summing up everything, right? You've created an index, first of all, right? By taking the weights that, say a country like Belgium took 0.8% of Kenya's exports, and you've calculated the weight. You gave it some weight based on that share, right? Let's actually go back and see what it was for Belgium. So Belgium's reweighted share of exports is 0.009. So you take that 0.009 and multiply it by the index that we calculated before, right? Let's say Belgium, right? Here, 102.7. You multiplied it by this index in order to obtain 0.05. And then you did that for all the countries to which Kenya made exports, and you added them up. And here you had 100 for that first year, 1998, the base. So that means the calculation is working. And then you added them up all the way to the year 2030. And then calculated the percentage change in Kenya's export market, because this basket of countries actually represents Kenya's export market. Now remember, the assumption that we made was that Kenya's export market was the same throughout those years, 1998 to 2023. And not only was it the same, but the countries to which Kenya exported took the same share every single year. So every single year, if the weight was 0.008, let's say some country took 20% of Kenya's exports in 2023, well, we assume that that country took 20% of Kenya's exports throughout the period. Now you can see that's a simplification. An extension to this work would actually have us calculate weights for every single year. Now we go on. We calculated in indices for both 2022 and 2023. Fine, that has been explained. Now, we also took Kenya's volume of exports of goods, took that data and calculated the change throughout every year. You're saying how many goods, physical goods, did Kenya export in a given year, that volume, and then how did that volume change year on year. Then now here what you have is comparison of Kenya's exports growth rate, the change in the volume of goods exported to the world compared to the change in the growth rate of Kenya's export markets, right? The destination. Here you have data pertaining to the volume of imports the whole world made every year and how that volume of imports changed year on year. All three are now displayed on this chart. So what issues emerged? Now we had 4 issues in the construction of goods export market growth series for Kenya. The first issue was this: goods or goods and services. Should we focus on goods exclusively or goods and services together? Now, what did we decide? Let me show you. What we decided was this. Now you can see on this table that Kenyan exports to the world in trillions of shillings. Exports and services were actually 0.755 trillion shillings, or 755 billion shillings. But exports in goods were valued at 10.1 trillion shillings. So the index of Kenya's export market growth was constructed by using IMF World Economic Outlook database to extract global exports and goods, and Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data to extract Kenya's export partner share of Kenya's exports. Kenya exports more goods than it does services, as shown in the first table. This assertion can be confirmed by comparing the percentage share of goods and services to Kenya's exports from Kenya's balance of payments data. As of the year 2023, Kenya's export composition was 93% goods and 7% services. So, some nations make significant services exports to the world. In those cases, it may be prudent to use both goods and services exports to calculate changes in the country's export growth and export market growth. Now, relative to its exports and goods, Kenya's exports and services were low in the year 2023. As such, Kenya's exports and services were not used in this analysis. Historically, Kenya's exports and services had little bearing on Kenyan export growth and Kenyan export market growth, right? So they were not insignificant, but they were not so important in the big picture, which is what we are primarily concerned with. Now, the second problem encountered, the choice between fixed or moving weights. Now, to create this index of Kenya's export market growth, the analysis exploits global import volume data presented by the IMF and data presented by Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics pertaining to Kenyan export values. The data from the IMF on the volume of imports of goods was used to create an index of Kenya's export trade partners' import volumes indices, and used the base of the year 1998 to allow for the inclusion of China, whose import volumes were available from 1998 to the rest of the year for which the data exists. Using Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data, Kenya's goods export value data by country of destination, weights by countries were calculated to help weigh Kenya's export destination indices. The available data set allowed for the calculation of weights for the year 2022 and 2023. Now, this is limiting, as I mentioned before, because moving weights year on year would create weights that actually account for changes in market size. And this is something that, as a policymaker, you would want to know. The index on Kenya's export partners is as presented by the KNBS, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, is then generated and knocked against data. As I mentioned before, the data on export volumes. Now, I will not belabor that point. I will leave that there as it was explained prior again. Now, what about the issue of primary and differentiated products? Now, primary products have a global market with their demand distributed across the world. Differentiated products might be destination specific in terms of exports and imports. Now, differentiated products are products that have been processed further. There's been more transformation of a raw material. So the Kenya Export Market Growth Series construction used aggregate export values inclusive of primary and differentiated products. The analysis would have been richer had the consideration uh, had differentiated products been considered. What does this mean? A drop in a drop or expansion in the market size of these products would lead to rise or drop in Kenya's export market size because of the destination specificity of the product, right? The product is going to a specific destination. Any change to that market will actually change Kenya's export composition. So if suddenly no one is buying something very special like a chess set, right? Then Kenya's export market size will actually grow or shrink based on, because that product is so specific. If that person or that market stops buying that product, it's not like that product finds a new market immediately. This is unlike more commodified products that have lent themselves to lower differentiation. They're just going to go anywhere. One market falls, then they're going to find somewhere else to go. Cut flowers. Now, the world market for cut flowers is primarily based in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, now, Uganda, Pakistan, and the Netherlands were Kenya's most important export destinations in the year 2023. Each of these countries took 0.14, 0.08, and 0.08 in weights, or you could say 14% and 8% respectively. Okay, let me make that easier. Uganda took 14% of Kenya's exports. Pakistan took 8% of Kenya's exports. And the Netherlands took 8% of Kenya's exports. Kenya makes its exports in cut flowers to the Netherlands, right? Primarily. Now, in reality, the Netherlands houses an auction market that redistributes Kenyan flowers to other nations, first in Europe and then, of course, around the world. It's highly probable that the Netherlands owes its weight in this analysis, right? In the analysis in Kenya's in the share of Kenyan exports that it takes, that it owes this share to the fact that it's a center of distribution for these flowers. So its place as its importance as Kenya's trading partner is therefore highly exaggerated. Furthermore, publicly available Kenyan data does not track the flow of its cut flowers to their final destination. In failing to determine the final destination of cut flowers, the analysis is therefore incomplete. As cut flowers are a differentiated product, this analysis is limited as therefore as an analysis of the cut flower market. The failure of this analysis to track changes in the market size for cut flowers can be corrected in a future extension of this work. Thank you. Now that's just the background on how we calculated this work. The next video presents the findings themselves and then tries to tell us where we are as, rather where the country of Kenya is in terms of its trade relations with the world. Thank you.